The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience, and most especially, thank you to our to the members of our subcommittee and some visitors that we might have join into our subcommittee today. And after recognizing myself and my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, ladies and gentlemen, your written statements will be made part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Just last week, in an interview aired on CBS News, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia stated, quote, "But without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we would follow suit as soon as possible," end quote. This interview aired just days after Energy Secretary Rick Perry flew to London to discuss a 123, or nuclear cooperation agreement, with senior Saudi officials. Saudi Arabia is planning to build 2 nuclear reactors along the Persian Gulf in the near future, with plans to expand to at least 16 reactors across the country. But what should alarm us all is Saudi Arabia's insistence that it be allowed to have enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, and statements about acquiring a nuclear weapon. The Crown Prince's interview just last week is reason enough to have the administration pump the brakes on the negotiations and insist that there will be no 123 agreement that includes enriching and reprocessing. Unfortunately, from the little we do know from the administration, it is looking at this deal in terms of economics and in terms of commerce, and national security implications only register as a minor issue, if at all. I am not completely opposed to Saudi Arabia having a peaceful nuclear program, but the idea of Saudi Arabia having a nuclear program with the ability to enrich is a major national security concern. There are security risks to consider. As we all know, the Middle East is a region that's constantly ensnared in conflict and instability, or on the verge of conflict and instability. We don't need to look further than on Saudi Arabia's own borders, where the kingdom is leading a coalition against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis already target Riyadh's airport in a missile attack. Hezbollah is amassing its presence in Yemen, and you can be sure that any nuclear infrastructure that goes up will be a target as well. There are also proliferation risks to consider, and the precedent that we may set if we allow Saudi Arabia to enrich, as other countries in the region will want similar capabilities. When we negotiated the UAE 123 agreement, our partners in the UAE voluntarily agreed to renounce enrichment and reprocessing capabilities and technologies. This was a watershed agreement, and this has become what we now know as the gold standard. The previous administration abandoned the pursuit of the gold standard for all nuclear cooperation agreements after the UAE deal, and it appears that the current administration, sadly, is following suit. And that is why yesterday I joined our colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, in sending a letter to the administration urging it to pursue nothing short of the gold standard in its negotiations with the Saudis. Without those assurances, we feel it would be necessary to oppose the agreement. There are too many concerns. There's no justification for our friends in Saudi Arabia to have enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. Unfortunately, the way that the current system is set up, as you know, it is rigged in favor of the administration, any administration getting its 123 agreements approved no matter what. When the administration submits its agreement to Congress for our review period, we have hearings and we debate the merits of the agreement, but then the only way that Congress can block the proposals is by passing a joint resolution of disapproval. Not only would Congress need a majority of votes for the disapproval, we would need a large enough majority in order to override the president's veto. And that is not how it should work. These are agreements that have great national security implications, that we should all have robust debate. All of these deals should be thoroughly vetted, and Then, if there is no gold standard, Congress should have to vote to approve the proposal and say in the affirmative, we agree with the president. Yes, this is a good deal. And that is why Brad and I, along with Judge Poe and Ranking Member Keating of our Non-Proliferation Subcommittee, introduced a bill today that would amend this process. It's called the Nuclear Cooperation Reform Act. We want to amend the Atomic Energy Act, that's the underlying law that governs these 123 agreements and the approval procedures, so that Congress reasserts our proper oversight role. Our bill would force a vote of approval on any 123 agreement that falls short of the gold standard, and that's the way it should be. We should not allow these agreements to come into force passively, and we should not cede our authority to oversee and approve these agreements to the executive branch. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this plan, and with that, I very much look forward to the statement, opening statements from our ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks for calling today's hearing. Thanks for our witnesses. For many members, today is an opportunity to explore both the positives and negatives of a nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia. We look forward to a productive discussion about this important subject. We in the United States Congress are strongly committed to ensuring only responsible and peaceful use of nuclear technology around the world and preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons technology. We also understand the role energy security plays in the prospects for long-term stability in the Middle East. As such, the United States has demonstrated high standards for nuclear agreements in past negotiations. The U.S. agreement that paved the way for the United Arab Emirates to begin its nuclear energy program has been praised as upholding the gold standard of 123 agreements for its prohibition on enrichment and reprocessing. As more Middle East nations seek to diversify their energy portfolios and limit their reliance on fossil fuels, we now must ask ourselves if the gold standard is the bar that the United States must always uphold. I believe in working to boost the U.S. economy, but not at the expense of our commitment to good decision-making on sharing our nuclear technology. Saudi Arabia is a strong ally in the Middle East and has consistently shared U.S. priorities to counter terrorism and limit the spread of dangerous Iranian-backed groups and militant ideology. The kingdom, however, continues to lag on several fronts, including human rights, governmental and business transparency, and military deficiencies. Its government, military, and private sector see a large influx of funding, but still suffers from mismanagement and inefficiencies stemming from the country's reliance on patronage, corruption, and nepotism. Promotions based off lineage rather than expertise, corruption, and other bad practices will continue, I'm afraid, to limit Saudi Arabia from thriving and growing. Reform is happening, albeit slowly, and we should be supportive of the steps the government has taken to address some of these shortcomings. Shakeups are trying to remove corruption and make its industries and ministries more efficient. The reforms have touched high levels of Saudi Arabia's government, military, and private sector, including concentrated efforts to root out corruption and graft at Aramco before a highly anticipated public offering that aimed to build investor confidence and address criticisms of widespread corruption and lack of transparency in the company. Only time and transparency will tell if these reforms will see Saudi Arabia make honest efforts to turn its back on bad practices. But we continue to be hopeful, and we continue to watch the rapid pace of reforms, especially as the changes may have important implications on the country's stability and ability to safely manage something as important as nuclear technology. This comes at a time when nuclear technology is an increasingly important factor in Middle East relations and the battle for influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Past discussions with the kingdom fell short when Riyadh dismissed core aspects of the gold standard agreement with the UAE, mainly centering on its priority to retain the right to enrich uranium. Concessions to Saudi Arabia could threaten the UAE deal and set the bar for future nuclear technology negotiations. Conversely, the United States maintaining a hard line on this matter could conceivably push Riyadh to sign a nuclear deal with one of the other countries it's in discussions with, the most concerning being Russia or China, both of which have lax standards, quality, and restrictions. Russia or China being the signatory in a nuclear deal would also increase those nations' sway in this key region with our key ally, potentially limiting American influence. The future of Saudi Arabia's nuclear program also has important implications on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, which limits Iranian uranium enrichment, but only for a set period of time. The U.S. Attempting to restrict Saudi enrichment may be viewed as unfair in light of Iran potentially having the ability to restart this technology if it continues to adhere to the tenets of the plan. Now, I have long raised serious concerns about the sunsets in the JCPOA, but we have to draw some distinctions. The key difference is that Iran was already enriching uranium, and the goal was to prevent Iran's enrichment program from building up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium that is necessary for a nuclear weapon. Saudi Arabia would be building this ability anew. Obviously, uranium enrichment is no small factor, and its implications for a nuclear weapons program are extremely concerning. And while Riyadh assures the world that it only wants peaceful nuclear technology to boost and diversify its energy sector, the country also is on record saying if it believes Iran is building a nuclear weapon, it will quickly follow suit. Last week, the Crown Prince stated, as the chair already pointed out, Saudi Arabia does not want to acquire any nuclear bomb, but without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible. The fact that there are ample enriched uranium reserves on the global market that would be a higher quality and cheaper for Saudi Arabia to import rather than try to initiate its own enrichment capability leads me to think that the catalyst for wanting this technology is to maintain parity with Iran rather than for energy uses. The potential boosts for the U.S. economy and renewal of the U.S. nuclear industry are indeed desirable, but it hasn't been made clear what we can feasibly expect. It's worth discussion today about how much funding it would take to revive the industry given the amount of government funds most other countries that produce nuclear technology put into their industries. The risks are high and will absolutely set a precedent that will follow us for decades to come. We don't take this decision lightly, and I'm very grateful to our panel. I hope for a productive discussion that may illuminate some of these key gaps. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. And now I'm going to recognize the members. Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing today, and I'll be very brief so that we can get to the witnesses. Whenever we discuss the transfer of nuclear technologies, there is always cause for concern, and unfortunately, the conversation we're having today would be completely different without a resurgent Iran. The Saudis have to deal with an Iran bent on dominance for the foreseeable future. President Obama's Iran deal provided Tehran with the cash to expand its influence throughout the Middle East. And since the JCPOA was agreed to, we've seen the mullahs develop ballistic missiles and fight proxy wars throughout the region and on and on. Worse, the JCPOA makes it a virtual certainty that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon. Iran's nuclear ambitions raise the specter that other nations will be forced to follow suit, Saudi Arabia in particular. So, Madam Chair, thank you for calling this distinguished panel here today at this very critical time, and I yield back.
Well, you're so right. Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. And Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the ranking member. Thank you both for your very articulate, thoughtful comments. I just want to start by saying that we need to do everything possible to prevent nuclear proliferation. Even a country that we think we have friends, you just never know whose hands these weapons will fall into at a later date. What worries me is that we have a president who, I think he wrote this book, The Art of the Deal, who believes that success is based upon how much money you make. And I think there's some thinking in the administration's part that our participation in this agreement could reap billions of dollars for the U.S. economy. I know everybody here thinks there's much more at stake than that. I do think Mr. Deutsch raised, I thought, an interesting dilemma, which is, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if it was just up to us and we said, no, we're not going to get into this agreement with you, and that was the end of it, I think that would be easy. My concern is, and like what I'd like to hear from you is, what happens if we don't have an agreement and we just leave it for the Saudis to go and make one with Russia or China? I think that's the big dilemma here. Anyway, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony.
Good points, Lois. Thank you so much. Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Chairwoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, for convening this important hearing. I applaud the Trump administration for their aggressive advocacy on behalf of the U.S. nuclear technology in Saudi Arabia. The energy landscape in Saudi Arabia and the entire Gulf Cooperation Council region is shifting dramatically, with a strong interest in renewable energy and particularly nuclear power. The facts are clear. Saudi Arabia will construct a civilian nuclear reactors. The only remaining question is who will build them. I believe the commercial interests and national security interests are intertwined, with suppliers of this technology gaining decades of influence over regional energy, security, and non-proliferation standards. Sadly, the American nuclear industry has experienced setbacks at home, with only 2 reactors under construction at Plant Vogtle, adjacent in Georgia to the district I represent. The United States should be doing everything in its power to find new and emerging markets for its nuclear technology. Later today, I'm grateful to introduce a resolution with Congressman Don Norcross of New Jersey aimed at promoting a comprehensive U.S. strategy to engage in the developing energy market across the entire Gulf Cooperation Council region, especially with regard to nuclear power. This will include aggressive negotiation of peaceful nuclear cooperation agreements with the remaining GCC countries, just as the administration is now doing with Saudi Arabia. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Sherman of California.
Thank you for holding these hearings and allowing me to participate. We already have a gold standard template for 123 agreements or nuclear cooperation agreements. We have one with the United Arab Emirates signed in 2009, which prevents reprocessing and enrichment. Saudi Arabia also wants a nuclear cooperation agreement with us, yet they've balked at the idea of such restrictions. We need a gold standard agreement. Yesterday, I joined with the chair of this committee in writing a letter to the Secretary of Energy on this issue, urging that we press for a prohibition of enrichment and reprocessing in the nuclear cooperation agreement. And today, I join with the chairwoman, to the Congressman Ted Poe and Congressman Bill Keating, and the respective chairman and ranking member of the who are, of course, the ranking member in the subcommittee on nonproliferation, in introducing the Nuclear Cooperation Reform Act of 2018 to provide stronger congressional influence in the process of agreeing to nuclear cooperation agreements and requiring an affirmative vote of Congress before we enter into an agreement that does not meet the gold standard. Two points I want to make about Saudi Arabia. First, just because they're anti-Iran does not mean they're a Jeffersonian democracy. And second, even if you find MBS, who's here in Washington, to be utterly charming or pro-American, remember that the Shah seemed utterly charming and pro-American, or at least pro-American, back in 1978 and 1979, and all the weapons under his control are now in the control of the Islamic Republic. So we need to be careful and not allow Saudi Arabia to develop a nuclear weapon just because we're worried about the nuclear program in Iran, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sherman. And seeing no other requests for time, I'm proud to introduce our witnesses. First, we're delighted to welcome back a good friend, Henry Sokolsky, Executive Director of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center. Prior to this, Mr. Sokolsky served as Deputy for Nonproliferation Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And before that, he worked in the Secretary of Defense's Office of Net Assessment on strategic weapons proliferation issues. Thank you for being here with us again, Henry, and we look forward to your testimony. Next, we're delighted to also welcome back a good friend, Mr. William Tobey, Senior Fellow to the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and Director of the U.S.-Russia Initiative to Prevent Nuclear Terrorism. Previously, Mr. Tobey served as Deputy Administrator for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration. Mr. Tobey also served on the National Security Council staff under 3 presidents, and we look forward to your testimony as well, Mr. Tobey. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Ms. Sharon Squassoni, Research Professor of Practice in International Affairs at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at the George Washington University. Prior to this position, Ms. Squassoni directed the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She has also served at the State Department and in the Congressional Research Service. Great to have you here, Ms. Squassoni. We thank all of our witnesses for braving the weather and agreeing to see this hearing through despite the snow. So we greatly appreciate your commitment to this important matter. And as I had said, your written statements will be made a part of the record. Please feel free to summarize. And we will begin with Mr. Sokolsky. Probably move that microphone a little closer. Thank you.
There we go. Well, thank you very much for holding this hearing and showing your true grit in sticking to your flight plan, getting us all here despite our whining and complaints. This, I understand from my staff, is the 13th time I have appeared before you to testify on nuclear policy issues. I'd like to think—
Now you got to make it interesting, like Elizabeth Taylor said to her
well, I'd
15th
like
husband.
Yes, well, I do rhyme a lot. I apologize for that. I think it's a providential number this time. I'm counting on it. This is even not the first time I've testified about the legislation that you have pushed. In this regard, I want to say that it's been a privilege to work with you and your staff on so many of these issues since 1995. Your willingness to take these issues on actually keeps my faith in this institution. It actually helps me to get up in the morning and not be discouraged. And I say that about your example. I hope I haven't overdone it, but you can tell I actually think this. You know? Yes. So immediately, I want to ask permission to put 4 items into the record.
Without objection.
Okay. I'm not going to go over detail, my footnoted, rather detailed testimony, but to emphasize 3 points. First, I would plead with all of the members here not to buy the prevailing narrative regarding the proposed nuclear deal with the Saudis. The U.S. has leverage. It should use it. Second, after the Crown Prince's performance on 60 Minutes, the key concern about the deal ought not to be to what extent it does or does not promote American nuclear exports, but whether it greenlights Riyadh's desire to get a bomb. Third, H.R. 5357, the Nuclear Cooperation Reform Act, which demands a congressional vote of approval for nuclear cooperative agreements that fail to have the gold standard with regard to non-weapon states, is long, long overdue. I'll focus the balance of my time, if I may, on that narrative, which roughly is we must have nuclear power, the Saudis must have nuclear power because they're running out of fossil fuels. We're all going to get rich selling them as many as 16 reactors, American reactors, I might add, but that if we insist on the gold standard and don't rush to get congressional approval of an agreement that would be more permissive of enriching and reprocessing, our best friend in the Gulf will bolt, buy from the Russians and Chinese, and we will lose influence. The truth is the Saudis don't need nuclear power to meet their energy and environmental goals, much less to enrich uranium or reprocess spent fuel. Their neighbor, the UAE, announced that it will not be building any more nuclear power plants, but instead will invest in cheaper, quicker, non-nuclear energy sources. Ms. Frankel, I can just say to you, the odds of Riyadh buying Russian are about as likely as them buying it from the Iranians, because effectively they're that close, and I don't think we have to worry about that, nor do I think the Chinese or French products, for a variety of reasons, offer any attraction. I think it's going to be South Korean if it's going to be anything. As for getting rich, few now believe the Saudis will be buying 16 reactors. The Nuclear Energy Institute's own recent analysis now allows that by 2040, At most, the Saudis might build 8 and perhaps as few as 4, while others supporting a non-gold standard Saudi deal have even allowed that they would be lucky if they bought even 1. The last point is something to focus on. If, as the Crown Prince made clear in a 60 Minutes performance, that Saudi Arabia is intent on getting a bomb as soon as possible, he could do so by using one or both of the 2 100-megawatt electrical South Korean research reactors that he has already bought and does not require a 123 on. This system would afford roughly 6 times the plutonium production capacity of Israel or India or North Korea when they started off. It would be a sufficient bomb starter kit either for the production of plutonium or to serve as a cover to procure what would be needed to enrich or reprocess. The takeaway here is that we need to get the Saudis to accept the gold standard even if they don't buy American. Otherwise, we risk leaving the door open for them to get the bomb. One last comment. Some argue that one bomb will neutralize another bomb, that a Saudi bomb will neutralize an Iranian bomb, that 1 + 1 = 0. That's fuzzy math. Where I come from, 1 + 1 = 2, and in the Middle East, it quickly turns into a much higher number. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Mr. Toby?
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing on an important but often overlooked subject. I'll distill my testimony to just 6 points, but would be happy to elaborate upon your questions. First, the proliferation risks associated with light water power reactors are modest and manageable. Second, the proliferation risks associated with enrichment and reprocessing technology, however, are deep and dangerous. Third, Saudi Arabia is justifiably concerned about Iran's nuclear program. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has serious flaws. The durations of its key provisions are too short, and it fails to require of Iran a complete and correct declaration of all of its relevant nuclear activities. Even if the deal endures, and I hope it does despite its flaws, even though I was a critic of it before it was brought into force, our 46th president will likely face an Iran technically capable of producing enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon in weeks or months. Fourth, the further spread of enrichment technology would only compound these dangers and should be resisted vigorously by U.S. policy. Fifth, the arguments that the United States lacks leverage in this situation are overstated. The United States is the kingdom's most important security partner and one of its largest trading partners, particularly in the realm of arms sales. If we join a race to the bottom, we forfeit this leverage. Sixth, and finally, the United States has never before contemplated, let alone concluded, a nuclear cooperation agreement with a state that is threatening, even provisionally, to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We should have no truck with nations threatening to bolt from the NPT, especially not nuclear truck. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toby. Ms. Swasoni, did I do that pretty well? Thank you. You can push that little button there to activate your microphone. Thank you.
Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to share some views on the implications of nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia for the Middle East. I too have 6 points, Will, but we didn't collaborate. Before my 6 points, I want to just give a little bit of introductory remarks. So in the Middle East, countries have been slow to deploy nuclear power for a few reasons. Abundant oil in some countries, fear after Chernobyl, cost issues, and sensitivity about nuclear weapons proliferation, whether it's Israel, Iraq, or Iran. The first country to deploy a commercial nuclear power reactor, Iran, underscored the risks of proliferation. Perhaps because of that, the next country deploying nuclear power, the United Arab Emirates, took a bold step in renouncing sensitive fuel cycle capabilities. Separately, and in its nuclear cooperation agreement with the U.S., the UAE rejected pursuit of domestic uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing. As the members have noted, that's been called the gold standard. Why did the UAE do that? Well, it was confident that the international market would supply its fuel while being sensitive to the need to instill confidence in the international community about its peaceful nuclear intentions. Besides, as the U.S. has proven, it's possible to run 100 reactors while relying on foreign sources of uranium and/or enrichment and without having reprocessing at all. Saudi Arabia is taking a different approach. The U.S. has been trying for 10 years to persuade Saudi Arabia to commit to relying on the international market, but Saudi officials are wary. Technology and economics are less important here than politics. Saudi officials have stated consistently since 2011 that they would match Iranian nuclear capabilities, whether just in uranium enrichment or nuclear weapons. For Saudi Arabia, obviously, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran is a problem because it does not completely eliminate Iran's uranium enrichment program. This creates a dilemma for all nuclear suppliers, not just the United States. It seems risky to engage in nuclear cooperation with a country that has avowed its intention to pursue nuclear weapons under specific conditions. How confident are members of Congress that Iran will not acquire a nuclear weapon? How confident are members of Congress about Saudi Arabia's intelligence capabilities regarding Iran's nuclear program? So here come the 6 points. 1, critics can debate whether a universal gold standard for nuclear cooperation agreements is feasible or desirable, but the U.S. has quietly implemented this approach in the Middle East since 1981, precisely because of the proliferation risks. There's no reason to create an exception to that policy for Saudi Arabia. 2, concerns about the JCPOA make it even more important to limit the spread of enrichment in the region. The best hope for reining in Iranian capabilities is to bring Iran into line with norms in the region. The JCPOA limits are the start, not the finish. 3, there's no substitute for U.S. leadership in nuclear nonproliferation, nuclear safety, and security. The point is not to lower our standards, but to raise others. And 4, if Saudi Arabia desires flexibility for future options, it should sign a shorter agreement with the U.S. An agreement with 10 to 15 years duration would match phases in the JCPOA if that's a concern. 5th, nuclear suppliers group members will discourage Saudi enrichment, but might support a multilateral approach that could possibly benefit the whole Middle East. Finally, part of the challenge in collaborating with Saudi Arabia will likely be a lack of transparency. Congress can help in the following ways, and I do applaud the new bill. I think it does a lot of important things. Saudi Arabia needs to rescind its small quantities protocol or adopt the amended version recommended by the IAEA. An additional protocol is essential to its safeguards agreement, but would also be a useful educational exercise for Saudi Arabia's new regulatory authority. And finally, you should levy a requirement for the Director of National Intelligence to provide annual unclassified and classified reports to Congress on WMD-related acquisitions and transfers to and from Saudi Arabia. You used to get those reports across the board, and for some unknown reason, they were ended. Anyway, thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Really excellent testimony. I'll begin with the question and answer period. The administration and the nuclear industry are both touting the economic and commercial benefits of a 1-2-3 agreement with Saudi Arabia. Exactly how much the U.S. economy would benefit is highly uncertain, as all of the models and all of the projections make heavy assumptions that are far from guaranteed. But this economic and commerce argument raises another question about the lack of congressional oversight. Trade agreements are subject to strong congressional debate. We have an up and down vote on approval. But 123 agreements, which also impact our national security, are passively approved under current law. If the administration and the industry are touting this agreement as essentially a trade or commerce deal, however flawed that logic may be, based on its economic impact, then should it not at a minimum be getting the same treatment with an up and down vote? So you can answer that when I finish my round of questions here. And on Monday, the Saudi foreign minister called the Iranian nuclear deal a flawed agreement, and the administration's next steps on the JCPOA are reported to be a major part of the discussions between the U.S. and Saudi Arabian officials this very week. And with the Crown Prince stating earlier that Saudis will get a nuclear bomb as soon as Iran gets one, it is clear that the JCPOA and the administration's current 123 negotiations are linked. So I would ask the panelists, what impact do you think the JCPOA had on Saudi Arabia's nuclear plans, and how did the JCPOA impact our leverage in 123 negotiations? And related to that, considering the JCPOA's enrichment restrictions, they start to sunset in just 10 years, what options do we have with the Saudis, and how can we meet our non-proliferation goals in the region? And we will start with you, Henry. Thank you. Put the microphone on and hold it close.
I think we need to think a bit bolder than even Mr. Trump, and that's saying a lot, because he's a pretty bold guy. I think you can't just extend the duration of the kinds of controls on enrichment that are in Iran. The reason your legislation and this hearing is important is it ought to be a wake-up call that maybe we have to think big. And that would mean getting the gold standard, not just for Saudi Arabia, but that should be part of the president's agenda. In this regard, the quickest, smartest way to help that happen is to take the advice that the UAE actually is giving by not going any more nuclear, to provide assistance to folks in the region for lots of things that make more economic sense. I have entered into the record 2 recent studies by leading energy economists that show what the kinds of things are that you would do, where you make money and you don't have to worry about bombs or being bombed, because these facilities, when they're large, get targeted. So that, I guess, is my brief answer.
Very much. Mr. Toby?
So, Madam Chair, if I understood your questions correctly, it was what impact did the JCPOA have on Saudi thinking, and how did that affect our leverage in this situation? So it's very clear that the weaknesses in the JCPOA drive valid Saudi concerns. I just happen to think that the correct way to address those weaknesses is not by a Saudi nuclear weapons program, but by other means, which are quite possible, that would bring to bear American influence, political, military, diplomatic, on the situation. With respect to what impact it had on our leverage, those that say that we have no leverage on this situation because others will sell the reactor ignore broader aspects of the problem. It's true that within the narrow focus of just nuclear matters, there are other suppliers that would be willing to take the field. But Saudi Arabia would be foolish to take on Iran without American support.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Swasoni?
Thank you. On the question of what economic benefits we might have, I think it's important to remember that a 123 agreement is not a contract. And honestly, Westinghouse is not in a good position to be selling reactors. I agree with Henry that it's likely going to be a South Korean contract. Now, does that mean we should lower our standards to enable South Korea to get business with Saudi Arabia? That is not clear to me. On the JCPOA, I would say little impact, because really it's kind of a red herring. Without the JCPOA, Iran would be enriching. Let's not forget that countries can legally acquire enrichment and reprocessing, and they can stockpile as much material as they would like, right? If they have a big stockpile of bomb-grade plutonium or highly enriched uranium, they have a lot of inspections, it's true. But so whether or not, you know, the JCPOA has linkage to this, the fact of the matter is the U.S. does not support the spread of this technology, and the JCPOA, even though it has sunset provisions, is giving us an opportunity to bring Iran around. And we need to take every opportunity we can so that when those provisions sunset, they wake up and realize pursuing those kinds of capabilities is not in their national security interest.
Thank you very much to all of you again for being here. And now I'm very pleased to turn to my friend, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We've had lots of discussion about the decision on a nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia and having ripple effects throughout the region. I guess my question is this: we're at this moment where the president is now talking openly of pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, at the same time that there is conversation about entering into a nuclear agreement with Saudis, which may permit enrichment if, and I'd like to just, you've touched on, each of you has touched on this a bit, but if you could just explore what it means if both of these things were to happen, if the president pulls us out of the Iran deal, and what that would mean in terms of Iranian enrichment, then look at what impact that would have on a deal like this with Saudi Arabia, particularly in light of the comments that I referred to earlier. Mr. Skalski.
I'm reminded of the Tom Lear lyric, "We'll all go together when we go." Huh? Let's think this through. First of all, please don't rush. If you're going to do something wrong, don't be in a rush for it. I always tell my staff, if you're going to do something stupid, take your time, okay? Second, if it's going to be really foolish, let's put it to a vote. I'll tell you why you want to do all that, because your question goes directly to our future. Saudis clearly are going to try to bootstrap up. If the Iranians break out of that deal, or that deal is terminated, you'll see them ramp up their enrichment almost certainly, is quite likely, or in time. The Saudis will then work with what they have, whether they buy it from us or not. They have those 2 Korean reactors. They can use that as everything they need to do what they want to. They don't even have to buy American or Russian or any of that. What then will happen is the UAE, if we strike this deal with the Saudis, will say, hey, what about us? We have a clause that says we should at least be given an opportunity to amend ours. So too does Egypt, and its deal comes up, I believe, in 2021. Then Turkey, our favorite ally. You folks must have a hearing or 2 on that. 2023, Morocco. And let's not forget why Mr. Sherman showed up. South Korea. They want to enrich. At a minimum, even their current president wants nuclear submarines. And previously, the president before that wanted to do recycling. Well, you have a deal with Saudi Arabia. What about us? And then, of course, you have what Japan will do. Do you get the picture? I mean, it's a mess. You are throwing kerosene on the embers of the current proliferation problem, and the expectation that with enough of it, you'll snuff the fire out.
Mr. Toby, Ms. Squassoni, what would you tell the Emiratis when they come to us after a deal is struck with Saudi Arabia that permits enrichment, and assume that happens, assume also that the president pulls us out of the Iran deal, the Emiratis come and say, well, wait a second, in light of everything that's going on in the region, you're our ally, we assume you're going to be willing to renegotiate our deal. That gold standard just doesn't work anymore. What's our response?
The UAE deal provides for the ability to renegotiate if the UAE faces terms that are less favorable than others that are negotiated subsequently. So they have the right to pursue that, and there's not much we can do. I actually think the UAE is unlikely to do so because I regard them as a genuinely responsible non-proliferation player. Your earlier question about what the combined impact of the withdrawal from the JCPOA and green light to Saudi enrichment would be, the short answer is it would be a proliferation disaster. I've been a critic of the JCPOA, but if the duration is one of your criticisms, taking its duration to 0 makes no sense whatsoever, especially since the bulk of the benefits to Iran have already accrued to Tehran, whereas the benefits to us accrue over time.
Just, if I may, Madam Chairman, just one last question, Ms. Squassoni. So let me ask, what would the response, what would America's response, what should America's response be then to the Saudis if the question is, okay, well, we would very much like to enter into this deal with you, but if you're not prepared to do it, then we're just going to go elsewhere. I know Mr. Skulski says unlikely the Russians. I understand why, but Russians, South Koreans, anywhere else. What's our response then?
Well, there's a thing called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, where we harmonize our export controls, and Russia and China are members of that. You know, I'm not convinced that, well, first of all, let me just make something crystal clear. We don't give enrichment or reprocessing technology to anybody. We don't do it, right? So what we're actually talking about and what Saudi Arabia wants is our consent for them to do that with our material in the future. So they've got to get it from somewhere else. We still, even though we stirred the pot 10 years ago with the India deal, we still have a lot of leverage within the Nuclear Suppliers Group. If the JCPOA goes away and there's nothing to replace it, and we have an agreement with Saudi Arabia, or we don't, Saudi Arabia has to go to someone to ask them for enrichment and reprocessing. If no one in the Nuclear Suppliers Group will give it to them, they could go to North Korea, or they could go to Pakistan. In either way, that is creating a whole other dynamic in the region. It would be even worse than Henry's, pouring oil on the fire. That would be a disaster. I'm not saying it's going to come to pass, but they do have limited options. In terms of what we tell Saudi Arabia, it is, you are a nuclear newcomer state. You do not need enrichment and reprocessing. We have a standard in the Middle East, which we are committed to upholding. And if you're concerned in the future, let's talk about it in 10 years' time.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Are the international inspectors, if we enter this agreement, are the international inspectors able to, are they overworked by the JCPOA? Are they going to be able to make inspections that are going to make us feel comfortable about Saudi Arabia following whatever protocols are in place?
In a word, no. And the reason why is they are very clear in Vienna, and they've been very honest, if we would bother to listen, that they cannot absolutely guarantee that they know where things might be if someone wants to hide them from them. That's what happened in Iraq. That's what happened in Iran. That's what happened in North Korea, and the agency, to its credit, was candid about that. We won't take no for an answer, though. We need to. There are limits. Not only that, but there are ways of operating overt facilities such that you can break out so quickly that the ability of us to convene a hearing, much less to do anything, might not be very quick. It's called timely warning. We don't have it. You can have inspections of light water reactors if you know there's not any desire to enrich or reprocess. You can keep track. You can do that. But if there's any reason to believe someone is covertly or overtly enriching or reprocessing, you're in trouble. And I think, I share the criticisms that Will Tobey has about the Iran deal on that basis. I think we're kind of kidding ourselves as to how well that can be verified.
Do you all agree with that as well?
Yes, and I would just add that it's important to understand that the scale of enrichment capacity necessary to fuel reactors is far larger than the scale that's necessary to have a viable weapons program. So it's easy to hide a weapons program within this larger system, which makes the breakout potential even more dangerous and the breakout period even shorter.
I have a slightly different perspective. I would say that under the JCPOA, we have higher confidence than we do under just regular comprehensive safeguards. That was the whole purpose, right? You get more information, more access to more sites. You have a lot of information about the procurement chain. So the measures under the JCPOA are better than what we have under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. But your question did not specify whether Saudi Arabia had an enrichment capability or not. I would say we have more confidence if it has a simple program with light water reactors. But when you introduce sensitive nuclear fuel cycle technologies into the equation, the confidence goes down. And let me just say one thing. Most countries with a complete fuel cycle are former nuclear weapon states or nuclear weapon states. There are a few exceptions. Japan, who else? Germany.
Brazil.
Well, yeah, Brazil and Argentina. Brazil has a small enrichment program. But that came from its weapons program.
Yeah.
So.
Aren't we dependent, though, on the country being forthcoming, permitting access, whereas my understanding in part of the Iran deal is Iran is selecting where the inspectors go, what soil to test. They are removing the soil and giving what soil they want tested rather than having the inspectors themselves choose the sites.
Two comments. I don't know how many lawyers are up here. Too many. Well, but I've always been told that I worked in the Justice Department briefly. Laws are meant to be broken, and people don't understand what that means. What that means is you gotta catch people breaking laws. And if you do, that's okay. That's part of the reason why even outrageous countries like North Korea are very concerned about the law and what they're being asked to sign up for. It's not for nothing that the Iranians negotiated as long as they did. It's not for nothing that the North Koreans took so long to negotiate the things that they negotiated with us. And it's not for nothing that the Saudis are very concerned about the letter of the law. You've got something here. Use it.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My time has expired. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you very much. So I want to go back to the statement that my chair and ranking member mentioned at the beginning. When Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met, he had an interview with CBS and said, Saudi Arabia does not want to acquire any nuclear bomb, but without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible. So here's my question. What are the steps that Saudi Arabia has to start to take to get to that position? And what is the leverage that we have to prevent that from happening?
I'll take a shot at that. Let's put on our bomb-making hats, okay? First thing you want to do is have a program that causes so much noise for anyone monitoring what you're doing that it's very hard for them to see the signal of you procuring the bits and pieces to do enrichment. You don't have to buy it from the Russians, the Americans, or the French. You buy it by going to perhaps Pakistan, your good buddy, and you say, how do you go about procuring the little bits and pieces, and who do you contact? And you put that together while you continue to train up and build some large reactor. And as I noted, even these research reactors are way big. Now, you have two routes then. One would be you could divert plutonium made in the research reactors, and there are ways to get around IAEA safeguards. I can go into detail later if you'd like. Or you bide your time and put together an enrichment program. A lot of people, I'm married to someone who's Australian, so because she worked for the government, I got to know a lot of Australians, including people who worked on their bomb project. And it did not take more than a few years, and as in maybe 3, for them to put together a really good enrichment system. We are assuming that the Saudis somehow are inferior, they don't know how to do long division, or they can't buy assistance. I think all that's wrong. It's been wrong every time we said that of the Indians, the Pakistanis.
What are their options on getting the reactor?
Well, they already have it.
Okay, so they
In
need
other
to
words,
get the
they are
material.
buying 2 of them. They will be built.
And what is our leverage? What is our strategy?
Your leverage is what the chairwoman is suggesting you all sign up to. Again, you reported it out of committee in 2011. Do it again. Repetition's the soul of wit in politics, I'm told. If you do it, it'll mean that the gold standard will be something the negotiators, who are not done with our deal, will be thinking a lot more about. If you get that, then it won't matter that they have the reactors.
What is our leverage to get them to sign that?
I think
If they can, yeah.
President Trump did a pretty good job on TV yesterday, laying out all the things that the Saudis are buying. They are not just buying pieces of hardware. They're trying to integrate themselves into the American security system. That, I would submit, is an enormous lever that, for some reason, no one's thinking about.
Got it. Anybody else want to add something?
I'd say it perhaps a more succinct fashion. We should tell them that U.S. support for Saudi Arabia is contingent upon Saudi Arabia's commitment to the NPT. And a Saudi nuclear weapons program will end the American security commitment to Riyadh.
That's it.
Got it. Thank you.
I agree with my esteemed colleagues.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. And got to say, Mr. Sokolsky, I very much enjoy your repartee and your answers. It's nice to have color in our hearings now and then. No, but I mean that as a compliment. You indicated, look, the odds of Riyadh, because we keep on hearing, well, if we press them too hard, they're going to go to Russia or China. And you said the odds of Riyadh buying Russian are about as likely as them buying Iranian because they're about that close. Similarly, China's not an attractive option either. Could you expand on that? Because I think we hear that as if it's a real threat. I've never been persuaded of it, but I thought you'd expand on your statement.
This was an insight I got from someone from Congressional Research Service who I don't think thought through what he meant, and we both worked this up in our heads. Let's say you're interested in a bomb option. You're a Saudi. Putting aside the quality of the product, which I got to tell you is not great. The last time their export version was put up on the grid for a safety test, it immediately had to be taken off the grid. Putting aside that when you allow the Russians into your financial dealings, you lose money, or in the case of the South Africans, you get thrown out for corruption. Put all that aside.
Or you could even get compromised politically, but that's a different
Yeah, right,
subject.
right. Put all that aside, there's a bigger problem. Your game has to be to keep the world from knowing what you're doing. Why would you let the Russian technicians, who are thick as thieves with the Iranians, into your house? I am not worried about the Russians. If somebody wants to use that narrative to buffalo you, grab your wallet, walk out. It's not right in my head. The Chinese have a different problem. They don't have, and the French, they have the same kinds of problems. And arguably, we do too, Westinghouse. We don't have an operating version of many of these reactors that we're trying to pitch them. And the ones in China that might be exportable have not been reviewed or licensed anywhere in the West. They will be, but not for a few years. So, you know, there's a reason why when the original bid went out from Saudi Arabia, it was almost rigged so only the South Koreans could win it. They read the newspapers. They know what's in their interest. Now, we opened that up, but I don't think we should assume that somehow it's immediately going to go to someone other than the Koreans.
Yep. Well, thank you. And of course, the other thing is, if we fall below the so-called gold standard, we invite the UAE to insist on renegotiating, and we have basically dumbed down the standard for others in the region and
well, I mean, essentially, if you buy the Russian argument, you might as well just not pay any attention to this issue. You give them all the leverage, and you say, well, whatever you want.
That's right.
I don't think that makes sense
I agree.
at all.
I thank you. Ms. Squassoni, in the time I have left, so if we renounce or abrogate the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, doesn't that incentivize countries like the Saudis to now have their own nuclear development program? Because clearly the Iranians will will return to their nuclear threshold status and beyond if we renounce our own agreement to roll it back or freeze it.
I think you have to ask the question, what happens if the U.S. renounces this agreement? It's not entirely clear to me that everyone else will take their toys and go home. Iran has certain benefits from continuing to adhere to the agreement.
But I agree with your point, but forgive me, I got 35 seconds.
Sure.
But my point is, should Iran say, okay, fine, then we're going to return to our nuclear development program that we had rolled back and frozen at your insistence under this agreement, doesn't that mean that the Saudis, this topic we're talking about here, have more of an incentive to develop their own nuclear program because they're now worried that the Iranians are proceeding? What we have on ice is suddenly no longer on ice. And Mr. Toby, you look like you might want to comment as well. Real quickly, because
I'll be quick, yes.
I thank the
There's an
chair.
incentive.
Yeah, go ahead. Ms. Squassoni, I'm sorry.
Oh, yes, that will provide them greater incentives. I mean, there are other things that the United States can do, right, in terms of security assurances, nuclear deterrence, other things like that. But if the Saudis are intent on matching, then there's not much we can do about it except put something else in place before you torpedo something that is currently freezing Iranian
Excuse me, well, it is a novel approach to diplomacy to renounce and abrogate your own treaty, but that's a different subject. Mr. Toby.
I agree with you, sir, and with Ms. Squassoni.
And Mr. Sokolsky, do you agree?
You're on to something, at least to this extent, for sure. You don't get the Saudi agreement in such a fashion signed out that it permits enrichment and reprocessing before you find out what's going on with Iran.
Yeah.
And I would urge you all to slow the train down. Getting that darn bill out finally again will be the loudest signal to the negotiators you can possibly deliver. The last time you guys had an opinion, do you know what you produced? The gold standard. Get on it again, will you?
Thank you. Well, we have a checkered past, but some of our opinions actually have efficacious value, and I appreciate your saying that. I do think it's important, though, what we just heard from this panel, and then I'll shut up, Madam Chairman, but is that renouncing our own agreement, the JCPOA, has consequences far beyond Iran. And frankly, I would have the unintended consequence, potentially, of actually proliferating, especially in countries such as the one we're talking about today, Saudi Arabia. So I would hope the President and the White House will take that into account, before they make any kind of decision. Thank you, Madam Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. No, thank you very much. And just to, if I might just have 2 follow-up questions, then anybody would be, if you wanted to, you could have one. Thank you. But just to emphasize the need for the bill that I've been pushing, has there ever been an instance where Congress has ever passed a resolution of disapproval and then, in fact, successfully blocked a 123 agreement? The answer is no. But go ahead. Yes, has there been one?
No, but in the case of the China agreement, Congress conditioned its approval.
True.
And there were no nuclear exports for 13 years. And so there are various ways that Congress can put conditions, can put certifications, et cetera. May I just take a moment and respond?
Yes, please.
You know, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Act of 1978 made a trade-off, right? It strengthened the nonproliferation requirements, but it also gave this kind of quasi-fast track approval, right? Passive approval. The one thing that it envisioned was consultations with Congress, and those have not happened. So when the U.S.-India nuclear deal came before you, it was already written. And so thank you for holding this hearing, because I think you have to start the debate before
We need to have a voice
the ink is dry.
instead of a fake process. Yes, Henry.
Actually, the fast track was locked in when we were in a propaganda war pushing small research reactors in '54. We went along in '78 with that again. Seems to me, though, that you had 46, 54, 78, it's 40 years. You're due to do an estimate of what the margin of safety requires. Surely you've learned something in the last 40 years about the adequacy of IAEA's safeguards, the willingness of people to cheat, our ability to keep track of covert facilities, and just how many things have been bombed. Take that into account. I think your bill is long overdue. It is something that has been, the corrections on what is an exempt agreement has been variated routinely. You're due. It's time for an oil change.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, we have some 1, 2, 3 agreements with Egypt, with Morocco, Turkey. They're up soon. So let's see what the administration is going to take these agreements one at a time, or what it'll do. Ms. Frankel, I know that you had a follow-up question. Yes.
I'm just trying to get something clarified here. So in listening to you, I guess we can assume that Saudi Arabia, hypothetically, could get the research facility and the materials they need without going through the United States, or without the United States participation. Is that right? Yes? Oh, you think so? Okay. Okay, so, yeah, that's what, okay, so that was going to get my next step to that. They are now a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is that correct?
Yeah.
Microphone on?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, and I know I heard you say we have a lot of leverage, which sounds correct, to over Saudi Arabia in a lot of different areas. But my question is, they've signed on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What more can we do,
Okay.
let's say legal, or should we do?
I think what Will Tobey said succinctly, and I didn't say succinctly, and I give him credit, is basically the Pope and the UN don't have as many divisions as we do. And if you are willing to tell your good friend and ally that we're there for them, but the prerequisite is they actually have to follow the NPT and not threaten to leave it and live up to the gold standard and get behind us leaning on the Iranians to get them to behave, it'll work. That's the reason, again, I think the legislation is reasonable and urgently needed.
By the way, as someone who's negotiated some of these agreements on behalf of the executive branch, I can say that it really helps to have Congress in the right place on these issues. If we can point to the fact that, you know, we can't get it past our Congress if it doesn't have certain provisions, that's a powerful tool. And speaks all the more about the importance of cooperation between the two branches.
Well, we're here to help, Mr. Tobey.
Did you want to add something?
I did want to add something. I mentioned this in my testimony. You know, Saudi Arabia is a member of the NPT, but it hasn't crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's. It has, because it has very little material in the country. It has what it's called a small quantities protocol. Back after Iran, you know, we discovered Iran's clandestine program, the International Atomic Energy Agency said, hey, all you countries with small quantities protocol, this is a huge problem because you won't let our inspectors in. So you either have to modify that or rescind it. They asked Saudi Arabia in 2005. We're still waiting. Half the countries who had those protocols have changed them. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the additional protocol, which is in the bill, 53, 57, and we should certainly ask Saudi Arabia to sign that additional protocol because it gives inspectors more access, more information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that follow-up question. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for everyone for being here. We look forward to continuing this discussion. This issue is not going away. And with that, our hearing is adjourned. Thank you.